Hello, Social 20, and welcome back. What we're going to talk about today, after last class, we addressed what civic nationalism is, and now what we need to understand is the roots of nationalism. So we're going to spend some time today looking at how nationalism and the idea was formed. And a lot of times people just assume it was always there, but we really can attribute a lot of the formation of nationalism to what we call the French Revolution. So we need to understand the basics and the roots of how nationalism came to be. So what we're going to look at today are the conditions in France before the French Revolution. And we're going to look at a system that was called the Ancien regime. Here's our lesson objectives for the day. We're going to look at some of the historical, geographic, and factors that went into the French Revolution. And to understand the French Revolution, what we really need to understand is how France was set up as a society at the time. So when we think about France in the 16 and 1700s, it was really a society that was very divided. They were ruled by kings. So here you have Louis the 14th, 15th, and 16th. And there was a huge divide between people who were peasants and working really hard in the country, and then what we call our nobility and our monarch. So of course, kings back then were not elected. They were born into the role. It was hereditary. It was not something that the people chose. And so we saw this system in France that was starting to be very unequal. People had no say. There was no sense of democracy. And we're going to see how did those conditions over all these years lead up into what we now call the French Revolution. So the king, who at the very far right here, Louis the 16th, he was the king that was ruling during the French Revolution. He was the last real king to have any power. He came to power very young. His dad had passed away when he was young. And so his grandfather was in charge at the time. And he was a very kind of indecisive, kind of a dithering kind of a king. And he came into power when he was just 20. So he was very young. And when he was 16, he dressed up in a big sun costume and did a dance in the court at Versailles. So he had this nickname of the Sun King. And he kind of came into the role perhaps not as prepared or respected as some of the other kings. And a fun bit of trivia for Louis the 16th was that he took only 2 baths in his whole life. And one was because he had a skin condition and he had to, and the other one he took and he swore to never have a bath again. So you can imagine what the Palace of Versailles smelled like. But in reality, they used a lot of perfumes. He would change his shirt multiple times a day, but Louis the 16th was known to avoid the bath. Okay, so understanding France at the time is to understand a society that believed in the idea of unlimited power. So kings back then enjoyed almost unlimited power because they relied on these 2 concepts that were very present in France at the time. And one of them was the idea of absolutism. So a king had unlimited power. If they made a decision, people didn't question it and they didn't have any sort of say into whether they agreed it was going to happen. As well, they were seen as an extension of God. So the concept of a divine right of king is somebody who was put on earth as this representation of God. And when you're born into a society that believes this, people didn't question it. They just accepted that these kings were sent from above, and everything they kind of did was seen as a sort of pleasure to the people, and how lucky we are to be in their presence. So understanding that this wasn't challenged. When you were born, you were kind of always told to revere these kings. And so these concepts were just passed down through generations, okay? If the king decided they wanted to have a party, and perhaps it's going to cost everybody in the town, 70% of their tax that month to pay for these kings' pleasures and parties and food, that's going to happen. People didn't question it, and that is the reality. They did some upgrades at the palace, and everybody would be giving, 90% of their income. So you can understand these extreme conditions. So what we need to also look at was France a nation? And when we think about a nation state in its current conditions now, we would say no. So considering the comparison of what France was then to what we now see as a modern nation state, they were very divided. So when you understand France, you need to know that people at the time were living in these very small areas. So people typically didn't travel more than 20 kilometers in their lifetime. Most of us have probably traveled further than that today. And when we think about what kind of a society that led to, conditions were tough. People didn't have money. There was no paved road. There's no infrastructure. It's not easy to get around. So what ends up happening is you have 400 different areas with people that speak different dialects. You've got people who are using different measurements and laws and codes. So you might go to one area in the country and then they're going to use pounds. And then the next area right next door, they use kilos, and they don't understand each other. And they're living in these kind of small little pockets. They don't have this general sense of belonging to France, the nation. They have a sense of belonging to those immediately around them. But there was a lot of diversity regionally. Many of them spoke what was called patois. It was a regional dialect, and the francophone French that we really think of today was spoken by the nobility. And that was another sort of a measure of hierarchy as well. So things like taxation, over 400 codes of law were enforced regionally. So you have a very divided sense of nation. People don't feel a belonging towards France as a nation state because they don't have that sense of shared unity. So what we also need to understand is the people who were not part of the monarchy were very divided. So in France at the time, the French society was divided. We call them estates. You could think about them as groups. You can think about them as kind of a class system, but there was three very clear distinctions. And we call them the estates, and you need to be able to recognize them by the first, the second, and the third estate. It is pretty easy to do. So when we're talking about the estates, over to the right here is a source, and you'll see this is a representation. It's very accurate. So the states were divided, and basically it was 98% of the population. They were the tradesmen, the working population. They were everybody who was kind of what we would call normal, was part of kind of this third estate, the guy at the bottom who's hunched over. It's meant to literally and figuratively show that they carried the next two estates. The second estate was called the nobility. And they were the people who would own the land, and they would go around and they would collect all the owings for the land, and they were fairly wealthy. But on top of them, so that was maybe I'd say 2% of the population. So we probably got about 97% are the third estate, 2%, and then 1% is the clergy. Clergy is another word for people who work for the church. The church and the state were very entwined in that point in society, and so the clergy was very powerful, more powerful than the nobility, but they had different roles. So the clergy was attached to the church, and so they would do things like they would collect the taxes that people would owe for the church, and they would go around and they would have somebody from the clergy. He would offer them to pay let's say $15 or the equivalent of, and then I'm going to give you a note, and this will give you a forgiveness for your sin. And so there were a lot of intertwined interactions with the clergy and the state and the power, and it was a very interesting setup, but I'd say about 1%. Okay, and we're going to look in details what the three estates were about and the division between them. Okay, so the first estate, and of course above all of them, is the monarchy, but they were not considered part of the estate system because they ruled over everybody. So the first estate was the clergy. So these are people that lived very lavish lifestyles. They were associated with the Catholic Church. They owned about 10% of all the land. They had a lot of income from the land that they owned, things like tithing. So when you tithe to the church, especially at that time, people were giving about 10% of their income, maybe more, to the church. And so they would go around and they would collect the tithes. And they would go to people's houses and say, can I please have your 10% of your income this month? And the church would collect a lot of wealth that way. They were generally disliked by the common people. They were typically people who were educated and they had connections to either the monarch or the nobility. They were not just the person off the street who decided that he was going to go be a priest and part of the clergy. It didn't work like that. So they were people that were also rooted in a sense of hierarchy, and they were getting into their positions mainly through connections and who they had known. On top of collecting the tithes and the land tax, they also would provide religious services, and they would charge for those. So things like weddings, things like baptisms, funerals, they would charge people for those. They were also involved in things like orphanages, hospitals. Most were educated, but it wasn't mandatory. It was more important who you knew. And of course, even within the clergy, there was also a divide. So people who would be in charge of, let's say, running the church and collecting the taxes, and who had very high connections, let's say, to the monarch, were going to have a higher position than just the people who were going to do the services in church, and they were going to run the orphanage. So there is still, even within them, a class divide, but the clergy was small in numbers and very powerful in money. Okay, the second estate is what we call the nobility. So the second estate was really defined by their money and their connections and their social capital. They were the people that had a lot of the land underneath them, and they would go to the peasant and they would collect the money. So that was called your seigneurial dues. So these people were mainly connected through property. They were oftentimes educated, but it was not as though people could get an education and move into the nobility. Again, it was people, nobles would marry other nobles, and you would stay in your class. And that was really important in that time. So the nobilities had a lot of privileges to do things like conduct hunts, execution by decapitation. If you didn't pay your taxes, they were the guy that would come to your house to try to get the money off you. He'd come back a couple times. He'd visit you maybe a month later. If you still hadn't paid within a year, they would throw you in jail. Worst case, they're going to cut your head off. They might or might not also kill members of your family. And it was seen as their way of enforcing both taxation and respect, and the way that they had to keep their status going. So if people didn't fear them, then they had no power in society. So if you were a male noble, you had about 4 choices in life. So you could go to college, you could get educated. Some of them were lawyers, some of them would own shops. So they did have the opportunity for education and advancement, but only really amongst themselves. You could join the military. There were some status even within the military itself, but they would be the people who are the commanders and the generals. They could go to page school. So those are the people who are going to work in the inner court and be very close to the monarch. People generally who are trusted. It was seen as a very privileged opportunity to get to go into the palace, or their other choice was really to work in academics, to be a professor at a school, to teach other people in the nobility how to be a lawyer or a doctor. And men were expected to obtain that strong education. Only the rich could afford the education, and it was kind of also their way of meeting other nobles, making sure they were staying in the class system. And more importantly, women at the time only had 2 real choices for your life. So you had the option to get married, and it would be to another noble to keep the bloodlines and the family money intact, or you could get married. You could get married, or you could become a nun. Those are your 2 options if you were a woman born into the nobility. So marriage was really important. The nobility were not really allowed to marry below them. The clergy, of course, in the church don't get married. So traditionally, the nobles had to stay together. And that meant that if they had met somebody who was in a different class, the family would forbid the marriage just based on keeping the class system alive. So marriage was really important for women, both socially and economically, to ensure that they were staying within their class system. If you didn't want that option, you were going to be a nun. Women typically were not educated at the time. It was their husbands. If they were educated to a very young age, and then they would stop. Okay, so the one class that made up almost all of the population, but was treated the worst, is called the third estate. So these are people like the peasants, the farmers, the artisans. Artisans are people who make, like pottery and plates and things like that, and what we now call the bourgeoisie. So the bourgeoisie were slightly educated, and we're going to see how that bourgeoisie actually ended up changing the entire structure of society. So peasants were living the life of farmers. They were really self-sufficient. Their whole life was just to make what they would use or eat or consume. So they don't have a business for money. It's about survival. So life was simple. So if you needed to eat, you go and grow it. If you need to wear clothes, you're going to sew them. They were typically uneducated. They had really large families. They lived in what's called the cottage industry. So they weren't there for profit. They were just trying to survive, and they'd have to figure out different ways of doing that within families. So this person would do the sewing, this one would do a lot of the farming, collecting, and they had a high infant mortality. They didn't have access to strong medical care. Infants would often pass away, mothers in childbirth, little social welfare, and really low social mobility. They could be very hard workers, but it wouldn't improve their situation because there wasn't that opportunity to be accepted into the nobility. So most of them just accepted their lot in life, and they lived under very unfair conditions. A special subgroup in the third estate is called the bourgeoisie. So they were starting to get small pieces of wealth. They were starting to kind of work their way into the nobility. Now, some of these people were going from working in a factory to maybe coming together as a group and owning a little factory. And then they would, try to expand a little bit more, maybe get a little bit of education. And they were becoming things like merchants or lawyers or notaries. But they were kind of that in between. They were still a peasant and they didn't have power, but they were getting education and awareness. And we're going to see later how this group became so important to changing the conditions in France at the time. So the bourgeoisie, the term bougie, that came from this word, the bourgeoisie. They were seen as the rich peasants. Okay. And a lot of their role in life was to serve the noble classes. They were paying 90% of their income in tax. So for every $10 that they would make, let's say from selling wheat on the farm, they kept $1. And they were employed and ruled by the nobility. And ultimately they were expected to tithe to the church, and huge expectations around, as a family, giving a lot still to the church. So here we see multiple generations probably here in this family of third estate, probably pretty typical. Okay, so you can see the clothes they wear, a little worn. They've probably made these clothes. The kids are, playing with things that are pretty basic, and they are mainly working to just sustain themselves. The army played a really interesting role. Now, if you were just a regular soldier and you weren't high up and you weren't a commander, you were kind of seen as very low. So some of them would just join the military really as a way to have a purpose. They weren't going to have any sort of opportunities anywhere else. And the king used them. So the king in the past had started conflicts and wars really just for his own real desires. So things like the Dutch War, there were wars started just because the king had personal interests in them. And so soldiers were really considered to be lowest of the low. They were used by the king. They were wielded around like a weapon. And so the military regimes were kind of formed by their individual regions. And we're going to see later on what a part of the military really came into being under Napoleon, so after the French Revolution. Okay, now just to conclude, was pre-revolutionary France a nation? So what we typically see as a nation is something to think about. We would say not the fully formed nation state. So the estates formed boundaries that kind of kept people very divided. France was not a political nation. It had an absolute monarch, so there was no sense of democracy. People didn't vote and have their voices heard. There were a lot of differences region to region, and the army really was seen as a tool of the king. You didn't join the army because you loved your country so much that you wanted to fight for it. No, no, no. You had nowhere else to go and you had no other opportunities, so you joined that army and you were used by the king. Very different sense of, let's say, quote unquote, nationalism. So they didn't have a sense of nationalism. And when we see all of the reasons why people engage in nationalism now, they really weren't there yet in France. See you next time.
If you enjoyed this video, check out our website, online.plrd.ab.ca, and visit us on Facebook, Prairieland Online Academy. You can find out all that's going on with Prairieland Online Academy.